Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining us at the latest research news. Under President Xi's leadership, China has come to play a bigger leadership role in global economic affairs. But what pushes some countries to support China as a global economic leader? To discuss this question and much more, today we are joined by Professor Lawrence Broz from the University of California. Professor Lawrence Broz recently co-authored a new study titled Explaining Foreign Support for China's Global Economic Leadership. Professor Broz, thank you very much for your time. So what pushes some countries and not others to support China as a global economic leader?
Well, thank you, Cam, for this opportunity to present some of our research to a wider audience. I'd also like to say at this point a thank you to my co-authors who are both in China. Zhiwen Shang, I work particularly closely with Xuan, who's at Sun Yat-sen University, and Gaiyong Wang was the other co-author from China. In answer to your question, the perspective we take on this issue is to focus on the rise of China as a global economic leader from the perspective of potential followers. We're interested in the research question, why do some countries support China's global leadership while others do not? And we think that's a new approach. Most people, as you probably know, even in the media, are interested primarily in China's motivations and China's activities, with very little attention to the followers. And we think the followers are important. By definition, leadership requires followers, and that's the angle we pursue. You asked what pushes countries closer to China in terms of its leadership. That's a theoretical concept we develop in the paper. We argue that while most common wisdom thinks about China drawing in followers by offering economic benefits, we also think that there's also kind of a push factor that comes with dissatisfaction with the current global economic order, that countries that have been particularly dissatisfied hold grievances about the current economic order that's led by the United States, and therefore might be drawn toward China, pushed towards China, rather than being pulled toward China. So we incorporate both sets of factors. And since these push factors are novel to the literature, there's no other work, to my knowledge, that focuses on the grievances that countries have toward the US-led order and how this might be a factor that moves them closer to China. We identify several of these grievances and test for them econometrically with statistics. We find evidence that grievances about international financial instability are the most important push factors. One of perhaps the most broken part of the US-led current economic order has to do with international financial volatility. Since the 1980s, the United States, as well as the International Monetary Fund, have pressed countries to remove restrictions on short-term international capital flows in and out of their economies. And this has produced an enormous amount of volatility for emerging market economies as well as developing countries. Advanced countries tend to handle this pretty well. They are able to. They have their financial systems are more developed. They have better regulatory institutions and so on. But in the developing world and among those rapidly rising emerging markets, international financial instability has been particularly disruptive. And we think that there's a reason why leaders of these countries might have a personal incentive to want to, voice grievances and potentially be attracted to China's model, which, by the way, is very different than the U.S. model. We often think of the Washington Consensus as containing a criteria that involves openness to capital flows, while China does the opposite. Or the Beijing model, China's policies are very restrictive toward capital flows. Instead, their model is based on financial globalization involving long-term investment, foreign direct investment by private companies, as well as infrastructure funding by the Chinese state. And again, this financial instability has been particularly problematic from the personal level of leaders because when they're hit by foreign shocks that cause debt crises, currency crises, financial instability more generally, this tends to have implications at the ballot box. We know that the recessions associated with financial crises are longer and deeper than regular recessions. And we know from the economic voting literature that one of the factors that drive voters to punish incumbents is the state of the economy. And since financial crises do more damage to the economy, we think leaders really worry about this. So we pursue this line of analysis and find support for these push factors involving financial instability. We look at, for example, the number of financial crises countries have experienced since 1990, really the onset of financial globalization. We look at the volatility of their policies, the capital account policies, where more volatility, more change suggests countries have had more difficulty managing international capital flows. And we also look at short-term portfolio flows themselves. And all of these measures tend to be associated with greater support for China's global economic leadership.
So these grievances that you were talking about in your paper, I was reading that some of them are specifically towards the IMF, which I guess, from my understanding, creates some of these problems and volatility. So can you perhaps touch a bit on what are some of the specific grievances that countries might have towards the IMF? And also, the IMF typically imposes some conditions on countries before lending them money. And from your paper, I understood that this also pushes countries towards China. So can you please just expand on that?
Yes, thanks. The International Monetary Fund's function is to provide loans to countries that are no longer able to borrow in private capital markets. And so basically, when a crisis begins, when a financial crisis begins, the IMF provides temporary emergency loans. And they do so with, the institution does so with strings. And as you mentioned, these strings are known as conditionality. Conditionality is politically sensitive in the countries receiving IMF programs because it often means cuts to spending on favored constituencies. It requires retrenchment, austerity, typically often privatization of state-owned companies. All these things are sensitive in the recipient countries. And so we think that countries may have grievances, not just about financial instability, but also about the conditions that are imposed by the IMF or required by the IMF as a quid pro quo for temporary loans, which they desperately need in these moments of crisis. So what we do is we measure the amount of social instability that occurs within a country, things like protests, anti-government protests, riots, civil disobedience of various kinds, that occurs during an IMF program over this span of period 1990 to 2016, to see if countries that have experienced more social unrest during IMF programs are more likely to find a reason to be attracted to China's global economic leadership. And we do find evidence that it's statistically significant, but it's not a large impact in terms of its magnitude. There is a relationship, but it's not the most important factor pushing countries closer to China.
So these are all push factors that push countries towards China. But did you find any evidence that China can pull countries towards itself through economic benefits?
Yeah, that's the standard wisdom, and interestingly, it hasn't really been evaluated with social scientific methods. So I think we're one of the first papers to look at these pull factors as well, the kinds of economic benefits that China offers. I mentioned that China's model of leadership focuses on providing infrastructure finance to countries, to promoting foreign direct investment from China to developing countries and emerging markets. These are more stable, long-term kinds of international finance, and we we also note that China has, in effect, targeted particular countries for this kind of support, international financial support, by way of its Belt and Road Initiative, which is based on these historical Silk Road trade routes. And so countries that are aligned geographically along these ancient trade routes have been picked by China to be recipients of these flows. So one of the things we do in the paper is we test to see whether being positioned on the Belt and Road path actually increases the likelihood of supporting China's global economic leadership. And we find very strong support. It's not just significant statistically, but also in terms of magnitude. It's one of the biggest factors pulling countries closer to China. We also look for proxies, other kinds of proxy variables that can get at these benefits that China is offering, and as well as showing sort of prior diplomatic relations with China. So we look at countries that have signed bilateral investment treaties with China, BITs they're called in the literature. And we also find a strong effect for having a BIT with China on the likelihood of supporting China's leadership. And finally, for trade, we look at countries that have signed free trade agreements with China. All three of these factors, the being aligned to the Belt and Road, geographically having a BIT with China or having an FTA with China, all pull countries closer to China. So we can effectively confirm some of the common wisdom about what's going on in our paper. But I think the new theoretical contribution is that we focus on grievances as well. We include grievances in our sort of understanding of this global leadership transition that may be underway as the U.S. retreats from leadership and China steps forward. Our contribution is to identify countries that are supporting China's leadership.
So I would actually like to come back to the Belt and Road Initiative, which I find to be very interesting. But just before that, there is a specific argument which you didn't find evidence for, and it has to do with the U.S. and the World Trade Organization and U.S. trade policies. So can you please elaborate on that specific argument which you didn't find any evidence at pushing countries towards China?
Yeah, the argument is that while the U.S. was the progenitor of the World Trade Organization, the major force behind its development, going all the way back to its prior form, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. The U.S. has been the leader behind the move to create a multilateral trade organization known today as the WTO. At the same time, the U.S. has been charged by way of complaints at the WTO for being one of the most, for being actually the most willing to violate the principles of the WTO. So the core principle of the WTO is non-discrimination. That means that countries should not use policies that target particular products or particular countries in their trade policies. And policies that are exceptions to this principle are known as anti-dumping policies, where governments can impose temporary trade barriers on products that are imported from other countries that are presumed to be sold below their cost. And the U.S. has been the most frequent user of anti-dumping policies, which target particular products from particular countries, of all the countries, including the European Union. And we think this causes a grievance, right? That the United States set up these institutions to help constrain countries from violating the principles of free trade, and yet itself has become the most frequent violator of those principles. So we test for this by looking at complaints, countries that have filed complaints, the cumulative count of these by country at the WTO. And we don't find evidence that this is linked to support for China's leadership. Another argument that we test that also does not find support is whether countries' concerns about global governance, we call it, which is the idea that the current order's multilateral institutions are faced with a kind of democratic deficit in which some countries are underrepresented in the decision-making processes of these multilateral institutions, in particular the IMF and the World Bank. These institutions are supposed to allocate vote shares, that is your influence over policies, according to a country's position in the global economy. And emerging market countries in particular feel aggrieved about global governments because their voice is not commensurate with their position in the world economy, which has changed rapidly in recent years. We test for this, but we also don't find evidence. The primary evidence we find has to do with global financial instability. Countries more exposed to it are more likely to support China. We don't find evidence for the trade discrimination by the U.S. or concerns about global governance. One interpretation of why we don't find evidence for that is that while we do find evidence for these financial instability measures, is that well, there are a couple. One interpretation is that leaders don't have as much personal stake in issues like global governance and trade discrimination by the U.S. Yes, special interest and motivated individuals within countries may know about these issues, but we don't think it's going to affect the political survival, whether a country is fairly represented at the IMF or the World Bank. Is not going to impinge on a leader's political survival in the same way that a financial crisis would. Right, so that's one possibility. Same with trades. While certain exporters in a country are going to be angry with U.S. trade discrimination, we don't think that's a ballot box issue. So leaders may simply just not have the same stake in these other grievances. Another interpretation is that the grievances are expressed differently, right? So financial grievances might be expressed by moving closer to China, but trade grievances might be expressed by way of pressure on the WTO, right? And similarly, pressure on the IMF and the World Bank to reform their governance institutions. So we're not, we have no evidence for those interpretations, but they seem consistent with our findings.
I see. Okay, so now going back to the Belt and Road Initiative, what is China's Belt and Road Initiative? Can you give just a general overview for our viewers?
Yes. The Belt and Road Initiative is President Xi Jinping's major and uniquely Chinese vision of global economic leadership. It is a bilateral program in which countries partner with China to receive financial support for primarily infrastructure projects that will help link their economies to China and the rest of world trade and world investment. So the building of transportation networks, the building of communication networks, the building of electrical networks, all these things are desperately important to a country's economic growth and potential, as well as its linkages to the rest of the world. Its economic linkages to the rest of the world. So the Belt and Road Project is China's, and it's a uniquely Chinese institution. As I said, it's linked to these ancient trading routes, the Silk Road, and there's nothing like it in the current international economic order. So you may have heard about other Chinese initiatives that are more tied into the current order. For example, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is modeled on the World Bank. This is the AIIB, another major Chinese initiative, but it is very much structured along the lines of the current development bank, the World Bank, and it has a multilateral structure, so other countries have say over the policies based on their positions in the world economy, and so it's not as unique. We like the Belt and Road Initiative. And in fact, we derive our measure of this latent concept, support for China's global economic leadership, from the Belt and Road. Right after the election of Donald Trump. And in fact, just 3 days before Donald Trump assumed the presidency in January 2017, Xi Jinping made a keynote speech at the Davos World Economic Forum in which he announced a Belt and Road Initiative Cooperation Forum, a gathering of world leaders to be held in Beijing in May of 2017, an invitation open to all leaders of the world. And we derive our measure of support for China from leader attendance. 29 leaders, prime ministers, and presidents attended the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing in May of 2017. Another 59 cabinet ministers, so high officials within governments attended. And we think that's a good measure of support for China's global economic leadership for a number of reasons, right? It's marking this transition where President Trump has announced America first and a general withdrawal from leadership. And China, under Xi Jinping, sees this as an opportunity to validate Chinese global economic leadership. And this forum is this moment in time, not unlike the Bretton Woods Forum, the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, marking the transition of leaders. And so we use that as a basis for gauging foreign support for China's leadership. When leaders attend, when cabinet ministers attend, we weight cabinet ministers lower than a head of state attending, as in terms of the signal it sends about support for China's leadership. But we think it's a reasonably good proxy for this latent concept of support for China. You know, statements alone, in the language of game theory, can be cheap talk. Attending the forum imposes costs, not just opportunity costs. They could be doing something else, but potential political costs, right? Being attending a forum in which leaders of countries that had sort of bad human rights records, Vladimir Putin attended, Duterte from the Philippines, being seen on stage, photo ops with dictators and strongmen, impose costs on leaders. Yet, 29 heads of states did attend, and another 59 cabinet ministers. So we think that those costs, and being a behavioral action, not just talk, provide a good, reasonable, let's say, proxy for this sort of hard to measure thing, foreign support for China.
I see. So you measured whether a country supports China based on whether their leaders attended this major forum that you're talking about, or if they sent somebody else, or if they completely skipped it.
That's right. So a number of countries sent lower. The United States sent Matt Pottinger, who's a national security, very hawkish anti-China guy. And so a lower level official or not attending in our data, we count as not supporting China's global economic leadership.
And I think you touched on this next question, but in your paper, you stated that in certain respects, the Belt and Road Summit was like the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, marking the transition from British to American global economic leadership. Why did you say that? And just before you get into this, can you just remind us what was the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944?
Yeah, so at the end of, as the World War II was coming to an end, the United States was already planning for a new world economic order centered around the U.S. as leader. And it invited the leaders of all countries to a conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at a famous hotel, the Mount Washington Hotel. And 44 leaders attended. John Maynard Keynes represented the UK. The heads of states and treasury secretaries from all these countries attended. And at this conference, they set the framework for the multilateral financial institutions that would oversee economic cooperation in the financial realm. So the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were born there. And what's interesting, or what the parallels we see between this conference in 1944 and the Belt and Road Forum of 2017 are that both were aimed at resolving uncertainty about who would lead the world economy. So during the interwar period, there was a vacuum in leadership. The U.S. abdicated official leadership of the world economy, and Great Britain was the previous leader during the gold standard era, the first era of globalization, had fallen in economic position to the point where it couldn't really lead. The U.S. should have led, given its position in the world economy after World War I, but it failed to do so for internal political reasons, isolationism primarily, in Congress and among the public at large. So after World War II, the idea was to resolve that uncertainty by having the U.S. come out with this conference as assuming the mantle of leadership and bringing countries into the realm of into the organizations that would structure international economic cooperation after World War II. So the parallel is similar, right? We have a moment of great uncertainty about U.S. leadership with the election of Donald Trump. And China had been under Xi Jinping for several prior years, building up its credentials as a global economic leader, not necessarily an alternative. It was, election of Donald Trump was a surprise, and nobody really understood how serious the threat to U.S. leadership was. But at that point, Xi Jinping saw it as an opportunity to validate China's growing leadership role. And the conference was an effort to do so, an invitation to the world to come to China to discuss what cooperation would look like under Chinese leadership. And so, the parallels likely end there. But we think that there is a link in terms of our theoretical interest in leadership transitions.
Okay, so now going back to the summit, I was quite shocked that you found that African leaders were underrepresented at this summit. But is my general understanding that China has very much prioritized Africa and that they have a lot of economic activities going on in many African nations. So how come you found that there were less African leaders at this summit?
Yeah, that's another matter of interpretation. We don't have direct evidence for any particular explanation why Africa was underrepresented, but statistically so, African countries were less likely to show up among all regions. And our interpretation is that many of these linkages had already been established with African leaders, and so there was less incentive for China to encourage them to attend. China was really eager to get European nations, Latin American nations, nations from regions where it wasn't already influential on board. And they made great efforts to encourage European leaders to come. Some refused, claiming upcoming elections and the opportunity cost being too high. That's in cases of France and Germany. Italy did send their prime minister. But it was generally many Western leaders, I think, once they found out that Putin and Duterte and other strongmen were going to be there, were less likely to go. We test for whether nations had upcoming elections and don't find systematic evidence for that. But yeah, we think that the primary reason Africa underattended has had to do with the fact that their links to China were already quite strong, stronger than perhaps other regions.
So President Xi became president in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, and so under his leadership, China has become more of a leader in global economic affairs. So what does China's global economic affairs prioritize, and how is it different from its previous foreign economic policy?
Yeah. So we think China, and we find evidence for this in statements coming out of this Belt and Road Forum. We think China strongly supports international trade institutions that currently exist. We think China has benefited from the WTO, from joining the WTO and linking its economy so strongly with Europe and the United States through WTO membership. And we think that the model that China is offering is not to replace the WTO. The international trade institutions of the day are perfectly workable from China's perspective. And as I said, in language issued by and signed by all the heads of states who attended the Belt and Road Forum, they say this. We want to continue the WTO and focus on resurrecting the principle of non-discrimination, which are pointing fingers at the U.S. for violating so many times this principle. But they support the institution in general. We also think that they support the idea of development finance, perhaps with a slight shift in focus to more infrastructure investment. So the AAIB is another institution which is sort of consistent with the World Bank, partnering with the World Bank, where the Belt and Road Initiative itself is a similar, yet it is bilateral. And so foreign countries don't have any influence over the policies of the Belt and Road Initiative. So that's different. But we think the major difference has to do with China's orientation to international capital flows. As I said, China has long regulated short-term capital flows. It has chosen to put tight restrictions, and this is very different than the policies advocated by the United States, which has pressured countries since the 1980s to remove those restrictions. The IMF has come around a bit. Now it is much more cautionary about the conditions under which capital control should be removed, encouraging, I guess, countries to choose their own policies based on the development of their financial systems and the quality of the regulators. But in general, China is much more encouraging of restrictions on these capital flows. And we see this in its own policies. We don't see China encouraging countries to remove those controls. In fact, China often criticizes the current world order for its prioritizing the profits of banks and financial investors over financial stability. So that, I think, is the primary distinction between China's model of the world order and the current world order. In fact, we might see something of a blend where countries, including China, continue to participate in the WTO, perhaps with some reforms. You've heard about the pressures that the U.S. is putting on the WTO these days. But in addition, we would see China participating in the development and infrastructure financial regime, but very distinct in terms of short-term capital flows. We don't see any evidence that China is moving in the direction of the Washington consensus in this area.
So finally, Professor Broz, what differentiates your research from past studies? What is novel about it?
Well, on the theoretical front, we, for the first time, bring in the idea that dissatisfaction with the current order can be a source of encouragement for followers to target the rising new leader as the source of global economic leadership, or as the pivot of global economic leadership. And the idea that there are dissatisfactions and grievances pushing countries toward the new leader is one of our theoretical contributions. We also, as I said, find support for the more general idea that new leaders also encourage followers by way of offering economic ties. On the empirical front, what we do that's new is we innovate a measure of this concept, foreign support for China's global economic leadership, for the first time, and we're pretty comfortable with it. It's not perfect, but among the alternatives, You could think about statements of leaders for supporting China's policies. You could think about joining other organizations that China is developing, like the AAIB. You can think about trade links with China. All these things are much worse as indicators. One of the things we like is that it is the Belt and Road Initiative is completely exogenous to any current global institutions. It is uniquely Chinese. And we think that provides leverage for us as scholars to pursue this important question about the followers.
Hey, well, thank you very much for joining us today, Professor Broz. It was very interesting, and congratulations again on your new paper. And thank you for joining us at the latest research news.
Thank you, Cam. I appreciate the opportunity. My co-authors, thank you as well.